Anyway, my name is Karen Hamilton. You heard that. And the topic that I gave to Meta was unity and diversity, which really just kind of means I can talk about anything because I can just make it fit into the theme. But the overarching theme of what I want to talk about is some interesting stories and ways of looking at the relationship between religion and science that you might not know. There are an awful lot of stereotypes and assumptions about the relationship between religion and science, and so I hope that I will shatter some of them and add some new color to that relationship for you. As you heard, and I will check the time because we want to have lots of time for questions and things too. As you heard, I was a General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches for 15 years. I am the second longest standing General Secretary the Canadian Council has had since it began in 1944. And right there is your first clue about the relationship between faith and science for peace, particularly the peace part of that, because 1944 was, of course, a very dark time in the world, the last parts of the Second World War. And so it was a time when many peace groups started, and it was the time that the Canadian Council of Churches started because the churches in Canada were so passionate about peace and about there being a different way forward for the world, and so shocked and scandalized by the violence, and that's not, I'm not getting into a discussion of the absolute horror that was Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and of course there is nothing that redeems that in any way, but the churches were also looking to the future. How might we move forward in peace, and how might we do it together? So the unity in diversity is very much bound up in the call for peace and the passion for peace. So 1944 was the beginning, and I'm the second longest serving General Secretary. I do want to tell you, and I wouldn't end with this, but start with a really sad story. The longest serving General Secretary, this is a true story, when he was elderly and was no longer General Secretary, was on the subway, young Bloor, and in a connection with science, the subway was coming, and the wind that happens in the tunnel as the subway comes blew his hat off, and he leaned forward, and he was hit by the train, and he died. So I'm going to try, I promise you, not to have that kind of an ending, but it has always really touched me in a really horrified kind of a way. He made a grab for his hat, and at the same time as the train came in.
Is that Floyd Honey?
Yes, Floyd Honey. Yes, it was. So that has always felt very sad to me. But he laid a great foundation for the Canadian Council of Churches. And so, starting to spin the unity in diversity, 25 member denominations. We are the most inclusive church council in the world. And when we think of ourselves, and to use the kind of peace terms that we use, and I'll say more about it, but Walter and I know each other really well, we talk about ourselves as a middle power. We often will use that terminology. In terms of unity and diversity, we're actually at the top because we have a huge spectrum of denominations, including the Roman Catholics, including the Orthodox denominations, which have their roots right in the early church, evangelical denominations, and of course, good relationships and lots of working with the other faith traditions, with Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, the Baha'i community, as well, strong connections with the Baha'i community. So this is a Canadian, when we talk a lot in peace terms about the Canadian contribution, and this is a Canadian contribution in terms of unity in diversity. Oh, Walter has a question already.
So I don't identify Baha'is as Christians.
No, they're not. No. What I said was we have 25 member denominations. No, Baha'is not, but we work with.
Oh, okay.
Work with. So work with Judaism, Islam, the Baha'i tradition, Sikhism, Hinduism, connections with, and I'm going to come back to that around issues of peace. But no, it's not a Christian tradition. But for those who like this kind of trivia, when you talk about the monotheistic, it's not trivia at all, when you talk about the monotheistic traditions, you talk about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and then you should talk about the Baha'i tradition, because it's all in a line. Trouble is, and this, really I won't dwell on this, but if you want to ask more in the question time, Islam doesn't accept the Baha'i tradition very well. So there are still challenges in the interfaith reality as we work out our unity and diversity and interfaith reality in the country. There are challenges. But in terms of so the Canadian Council of Churches is Christian, but has, working relationships, particularly in the areas of peace and justice with the other faith traditions. But you might be asking yourselves, why is Canada at the top in terms of this unity and diversity? My standard joke is that if we don't work together in Canada, we'll freeze to death. And I say that jokingly, but I don't think it actually is entirely a joke. I mean, you think about our geography. We've got this huge land mass, and compared with other countries, a very small population proportionate to our land mass. And so that if we don't work together, what are we going to do? And it's very obvious when you do international travel, and Walter will know this as well, the Americans don't even understand our flight system. Because, like I have a reason, a meeting, I have to be in Rome, and the Americans are trying to book me a flight, and they can't even do this in a way that makes sense to Canadians because there's so few options. But in the United States, and Europe too, they're so interwoven, there's so many choices that they actually, the first quote came, flying me back from Rome. You can't fly directly to Canada, of course, to Rome to Canada in the winter, you can in the summer. But so they had me going Rome to Frankfurt, Frankfurt to Newark, and then transferring on a bus, Newark to LaGuardia, to Toronto. Because they just, anyway. But it points to, though, our uniqueness. So we have the small population, big land mass, all the denominations pretty much working together, because we also have the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada and the Christian and Missionary Alliance, who are observers of the council. So actually that pushes it up. Over 90% of the Christians in the country are working together in unity, in diversity. It doesn't mean we're all the same. It means that there is much we can do together while recognizing our particularities, and that's really important. And I think that's really important for the peace movement too. And to shamelessly digress, one of the things, and I've done a lot of work in the area of, and we'll talk more about that, peace and justice and climate, small arms, the Arms Trade Treaty, all of those kinds of areas. And one of the things that I have heard in doing that work is that the climate movement in Canada is very fragmented, and that some of the reason it's not getting as much traction as some of us would like it to get is because it kind of hasn't figured out the unity and diversity model yet, and there's too much competition and too much sort of siloing around particular climate issues, and not enough working together on the things people can agree on. Okay, that's a bit of a commercial and soapbox, so I'll get off that one right now. So I wanted to start with the unity and diversity, and one of the absolute key foundational pieces for all the Christian denominations and for all the faith traditions is peace. Peace and justice and equal relationships, and now of course the Truth and Reconciliation Commission around First Nations people. Everyone is in agreement on these huge issues. Climate too, and I was actually having a conversation with my son in the car on the way here about that, and talking about where some of the evangelical denominations who have been less quick to get on the climate change train, so to speak, but are also there now. And talking, the language is different. Creation care is often what they will say, but recognizing that we're all in this together, and the destruction of the planet from nuclear reality, from climate reality, from small arms, from spread of disease, poverty, all of these things are things that everyone can work together on. So I wanted to start with that, and I wanted to also make it very concrete. Most of you will have heard of Project Plowshares. Most people? Canada's premier organization working against nuclear weapons, in the network with ICAN, that just won the Nobel Peace Prize for its work against nuclear weapons. Project Plowshares is an operating division of the Canadian Council of Churches. This is less well known. It's been a part of us since their inception in the 70s, uses our charitable number, and so every Canadian Council of Churches governing board meeting with all those denominations present hears a major report from Project Plowshares. And so all of the Christian denominations are all engaged in that work, and so that if you haven't looked at Project Plowshares recently, please do. They're doing incredible work in the to push towards the abolition of nuclear weapons. Their small arms work is exceptional. The chart that they publish every year around armed conflict around the world is exceptional. They're doing migration issues right now, and so follow their work. But know when you do that they are totally, this is a shameless term to use and use and abuse, but they are totally embedded in the Canadian Council of Churches, in the faith communities. That's where they were born, and that's where they have always lived and still do, and their work is totally supported by all of these member denominations and other faith traditions as well. But that's, as I said, it kind of is what my preaching professor called a metonymy. It sort of speaks to, if I simply say that, Project Plowshares is part of the Canadian Council of Churches, and I've said the 25 member denomination, people kind of go, oh yeah, okay, now we get the peace connection. But so from the beginning of the council in 1944, all of these denominations have been working together in their diversity towards peace in all kinds of ways. And that's not to say it's not complicated. It is complicated, but sort of take that as an introduction to what I want to say about the relationship of science and religion. And knowing, so science, we're kind of doing science for peace, science and religion, unity and diversity, and how they are all bound up together. Science and religion. Now, did anybody see the cartoon? And I get both papers, so when I say I saw it in the paper and people go, which paper? And I go, one of the two, the Star or the Globe, I can never remember. But there was very recently, this week, there was an editorial cartoon, and it had Galileo up on the way, like this way, up on a desk, and then the Inquisition arrayed against him. And the line was something like, the Inquisition was challenging Galileo and saying something like, well, you're trying to disturb us in our nice, safe corner and safe self-understanding. And what it really was a protest against a repression of free speech. That's the point that they were making. But I looked at it, knowing that I was going to be here, man, I'm going, that's the perception that people have about the relationship of science and religion. That somehow, in that case it was the Catholic Church, somehow the big Catholic Church shut down Galileo and refused to listen to his theories about the universe. And it just actually isn't true. And yeah, I know, there you go, I told you there'd be some surprising things in this lecture. And let me explain why. So, and some of you will be more, I dabble in science because I do work in science and religion, but I'll be as careful as I can because it'll be easy for you to push me to a depth that I don't swim in quite as well. But at the time of Galileo and his promotion of the Copernican understanding of the universe, that the Earth was not in the center, and the Ptolemaic understanding was that the Earth was in the center and everything rotated around the Earth. So the Copernican system had the sun in the center and everything going around the sun. Okay, this is like my grade 5 level explanation for myself, right? And Galileo had been totally smitten with this Copernican. It wasn't his invention, it was Copernicus's, but they're contemporaries. And so he had been totally smitten with this and entranced by it and done a ton of work in the Copernican universe system and believed in it. What happened, though, which is not the perception of what happened, is that he was really good friends with the Pope at the time. And he and the Pope had conversation about this, a lot of conversation about it, and the church was not against it. Right? I know, this is important, this is not well known. What the Pope did, they had an agreement, they made an agreement, and the Pope said, yes, you can write a book about this, but I need you to present it as a theory, not as, you know, absolutely established fact, which Galileo at the time agreed to because Galileo couldn't prove it. Galileo had no empirical evidence to prove it. He'd watched the stars, and he talked to all the astronomers, and he'd read all the astronomers, and he was sure that it was right. But scientifically, he couldn't prove it. And the reason he couldn't prove it, and I had my son explain this to me, was because for the Copernican universe, as we know, for the understanding of the sun to be in the center of this little quadrant of the universe, and the planets going around it, in order to be able to prove it, you have to be able to prove, I memorized the term, stellar parallax. See, Walter's nodding, you know what this is, right? It's how you see the stars at different distances. And now, okay, don't push me too far on this because this is where my understanding will break down, but in order to prove the Copernican universe, you have to be able to demonstrate stellar parallaxes. And Galileo couldn't do it because the technology was not advanced enough. And there was a miscalculation, understandably, about how far the stars were from the Earth. And they turned out to be much farther than Galileo and others. I mean, they just didn't have the technology in terms of telescopes at the time. So he couldn't prove it. So he didn't actually have the scientific evidence. Subsequently, as technology improved, we found the stellar parallaxes, and you can see them now. But at Galileo's time, you couldn't. And so the Pope said to him, you can't prove this, so write a book, by all means, write a book, and put it forth as a theory. At that point, Galileo made a mistake, 2 mistakes actually. He wrote the book, but he didn't put it forward as a theory, which he had agreed to do. So he went back on his agreement, and he put it forward as absolute scientific proof that he couldn't prove. Mistake number 2 was probably worse. And the Pope couldn't rise above it. He trashed the Pope in the book. And he made him look like an idiot. And he called him a character called Simplicitus, and who was the idiot character in the book. Probably wasn't his best move to do that. So that's what actually happened. Now, needless to say, the Pope was not happy. The church was not happy. And, you know, the suppression happened and all the things that we know came after that. And Galileo was censored. But it's a much more complex story than it kind of comes down to us. And, you know, subsequently it was proved. But should the Pope have been able to rise above being trashed in a book that was now in print that everyone was reading? Sure, easy to say. But we know lots of people in the world right now who wouldn't be able to rise above that. And, you know, would it have been noble? Yes, it would have been. But Galileo also had an immense ego, and so that kind of tripped him up. So just whenever you hear stories about the relationship of science and religion, have as much skepticism and hermeneutic, we would say in theological terms, hermeneutic of suspicion as you do for other things, because there is that kind of reality. Interestingly enough, and the current Pope is Jesuit. The Jesuits at the time of Galileo totally believed in the Copernican universe. But they were radicals then, they're radicals now. It's the first time the world has ever had a Jesuit Pope, actually, is now, right now. But the Jesuits believed in it. But they couldn't prove it either. Nobody could prove it. That was the problem. And Galileo was proven 100% right, given the miscalculation of the distance of the stars to the Earth. So, skepticism on all fronts. Science has its blind spots just as much as religion does, and religion for sure does, no question about it. But it has, but science as well. So the relationship is complicated. And have you ever read, in this kind of vein, a book by Bill Bryson called A History of Home? He writes a number of things. He writes, I'm going to forget all the rest of the titles now. Anyway, he writes a very colorfully about, in detail, incredible detail. So he'll start with a cone of sugar from pioneer times, and that'll take him to the slave trade, because he'll be talking about, you know, how sugar was traded and what that meant for shipping, and then the abuse of slaves, and then slaves coming from Africa to the Caribbean, and he kind of winds his way through, you know, any kind of issue. But so in his book, so Bill Bryson is spelled with a Y, the Bryson is, in his book A History of Home, he says, you know, I've written about different places and different issues all over the world. Maybe I should start with my own house. And he lives in a house in England. It's quite old. It goes back to the 17th century. So he goes into the history of his house, and he finds there's a cupboard that used to be the telephone box, and then that, because this is how he thinks, then you get a whole history of telephones, and then he goes to Marconi, and then he goes to the telegraph, and wiring and electricity, and it takes him all over, just because there's a cupboard where the telephone used to be in his house. He's a great like sort of stringing pearls along in terms of thought writer. Anyway, one of the stories that he tells in that book, though, is very germane to what we're talking about tonight, and he talks about the local ministers in the Anglican tradition in that part of England at the time, and they were the scientists, because for whatever reason they had a little too much time in their hands, and I think it would be quite interesting to figure out why that was, but they were reasonably paid, not great pay, but reasonably paid, that they could use their leisure time. And what they did was, they were the best botanists in particular, best botanists and archaeologists. And so they went tramping over the land, and they recorded what they saw. And so much of the science of England, but spreading further, of that time came from these Anglican priests who experimented, and they observed, and they recorded, and they watched the changes. And then they were also the archaeologists, because they're finding ruins, and Roman ruins in particular, that nobody had ever done anything with. I mean, this was the 1700s in particular. And so this kind of work hadn't been done ever by anybody. So another example of the absolute deep connection between religion and science. And they were faithful recorders, and they did a very good job. And obviously there were things they got wrong. It was the 1700s, and they didn't have the science that we have now. But it laid a tremendous foundation, particularly in biology and botany at the time, but also archaeology. These guys, and they were all guys at the time, alas, but traipsing all over. Another sort of piece, and obviously I'm not going chronologically through history as one could, but another piece, which I think many of you will know, is that during the Dark Ages, so to speak, and it's very debatable about whether there were any Dark Ages, that we all learned this in history, but this is being really seriously debunked now by the historians. And if you want to read Thomas Cahill, How the Irish Saved Civilization, that's a fabulous book. And he talks about how the science and learning and literature all went to Ireland and was preserved there, and then was able to flow back. But what we did learn in school, which is still very much understood, is that much of the Muslim world, much of the Arab culture preserved science. And so the Greek, so the Greeks, who had a fabulous, fabulous scientific background for the time, the Greek writings on science were picked up by the Muslim world and preserved, And it was as the West was coming out of these so-called Dark Ages that then we rediscovered this. And so languages are crucial, I would also say too, in understanding unity and diversity and understanding religion and science and the relationship between the two. It was the scholars who could read Arabic, who were able to at least start the picking up of this again and bring science back to the West, because the Muslim tradition had preserved it so well and considered, you know, Aristotle and all of those guys as so foundational and important. They preserved it, and then it was able to be translated, came back to us. So thanks, you know, thanks be to God for that the Muslim world did that, because lots was lost still, but so much more would have been lost. And pretty much most of what we have around Aristotle in particular was preserved by the Muslim world, and we have a lot of it because of that. Which then, you know, enabled the Renaissance to come to be, and informed that, and art and culture, and of course, you know, science and art were always in parallel. Science and music, there's a huge relationship between science and music, and people will say now you should take mathematics and music, that those two should go together. So there were these interconnections and relationships. People in other periods of history were much less siloed than we are now. We go into music, or we go into, in my case, biblical studies, or we go into peace studies, or we go into, this is a very modern convention to break up knowledge this way. And partly it is a problem, there is so much knowledge that it's, you know, what do you do? You can't learn, you know, all the fields well. And so I don't really have a great answer for it, but I'm very aware of and that doesn't help us because we are very polarized, and we don't talk well to each other or understand each other's disciplines. And so I certainly encourage that. The Governor General. Oh, let's talk about the Governor General's remarks on religion and science. Let's do that. The short version would be there's fault on both sides, in my opinion. She didn't say anything technically wrong.
She mocked.
She mocked, though. She mocked, and that was unnecessary. That was really unnecessary to use that tone. Also, the other part of it, Walter, that I thought was a bit disturbing when because I read everything really carefully. It sounded like she was talking about an American context, and I read it, and I'm kind of going, this does not sound like the religious landscape in Canada. It sounds like the religious landscape in the southern United States. Absolutely. Maybe the mid-United States, maybe the Midwest, you know. But it doesn't sound like Canada to me. And so, but yeah, she mocked. She didn't say anything that was factually, whatever facts really are, but that was wrong. But it was an unpleasant tone. On the other hand, those who, you know, really pushed back also took unpleasant tones. And if religion and science both can't take critique, then there's something wrong with, you know, both disciplines, because it's about learning, and it's about unity and diversity, understanding both the unity and the diversity. It's about being able to hear each other, and it's about not, you know, reacting sort of knee-jerk reaction. You know, it's about listening. And so, you know, really it was unfortunate. It could have been a fortunate conversation if everybody had been willing to listen to each other and hear each other and have a deeper conversation. It just kind of turned into a kind of a tit-for-tat, unfortunate one, which has, you know, colored her first days as Governor General, which I hope people will, you know, soon forget, and I hope that she will have learned from, and I hope that those who couldn't really hear her either and, you know, reacted badly might learn from. So we can talk more about that if you would like to do that. But I wanted to go back to some of the peace, specifically the peace issues, knowing that this is Science for Peace, and to tell you a couple of stories. Stories are always the most fun. In 2010, I had the privilege of organizing the 2010 Interfaith Leaders Summit. That was the year that the G8 and the G20 met in Canada kind of back to back, and all kinds of wild and crazy things happened. There are still cases in the courts around the kettling and the in the pouring rain. How could that have happened? But anyway, he is being taken to task for that. But they were meeting, and it's very unusual. The G8, the G20 meeting fairly close to, really like a day apart or whatever. And it hasn't happened since, I think, because it was realized that it really wasn't actually that good an idea. But it seemed efficient at the time. So what I did was I organized, how can, in the face of the huge issues, which all the faith communities care so deeply about, what are we going to do as the faith leaders when all these political leaders are coming to Canada? So I organized the 2010 Interfaith Leaders Summit, and I brought faith leaders with zero budget, because that's the story of my life, and the Canadian Council of Churches, zero budget, so comfortable, the World Fed was well enough with a budget. Yeah, right, same. Raised the money, but brought the faith leaders of all the G8 countries, the major faith leaders, to Canada and from the G20 regions to talk together and to present a statement to the G8 and the G20. What's most important for this gathering is the 3 key points on that statement. What is it that you would imagine that all the faith leaders of the world would agree on easily? Anybody want to sort of like guess? Think fairly broad categories, but it's okay, I'll just say.
God?
What?
God. There's a God.
Yes, although terminology is tricky. What do you call God if you're a Buddhist? We had to work that through. That's a very good
Spiritual.
divine imperative is what we came up with. The divine imperative, and everybody was able to live with that, the divine imperative. But there was a kind of a breathtaking moment when I'm saying, folks, we have to have a term here that everybody can live with. And I think actually it was me who thought of it, divine imperative, and I'm kind of going, can everybody live with that? And I'm like holding my breath going, this is not going to go well if we can't agree on this. Anyway, and some of the faith said, well, this wouldn't be our first choice, but it's okay. We can live with it. We can live with it. So divine imperative is it. But yeah, yes, of course, everything's grounded in the divine imperative. Absolutely. But in terms of the concretes of the statement, there were 3 foci. And one was, and this is very important for any conversation about science, the Millennium Development Goals, what we would now call the Sustainable Development Goals. They were absolutely fundamental. All the faith traditions believe in the Millennium Development. This doesn't mean they don't know there are critiques that can be made about them, absolutely. But as a basic movement forward for the world, we don't have anything better right now than the Millennium Development Goals, but they're now the Sustainable Development Goals, and there were 8, and there are now 17, thank you. Yeah, it's a lot. I was actually talking to an American, speaking of Americans, who was in the final meetings that came up with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they were, they're a bit kind of nail-biting, and, how are we going to agree on which goals they should be and how to articulate them, and they're very complicated goals, a lot of them, now the 17. And he said, we got an agreement. I went home, I called my mother, and I said, Mom, we got it. We've got the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm a little unsure. I think 17 is too many. I'm worried about this, but we got it, but I'm worried because so many people can't remember them. Like I used to be able to recite what the 8 were for the Millennium Development Goals. 17, you can't anymore, right? Anyway, his mother responded, well, I think you need 17 because the world's problems are really complex and there's a lot of them. So I think 17 is a good number. And he kind of went, well, that sort of changed how I was thinking about it, actually. So Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, everybody could agree on. Climate is the second one. The third one is small arms and the illegal trade of small weapons around the world and the terrible destruction. We almost were this close in terms of the nuclear, and then the Russians wouldn't agree. Having agreed all the way along that we were going to make a statement against nuclear weapons at the 11th hour, and it really was the 11th hour. It was like 10 minutes before the statement's going to be released to the media. The Russians are going, well, no, actually, we can't go with the nuclear partner. Anyway, we were so close. But the small arms and the just absolutely devastating destruction of small arms and the illegal trade of small arms and the effect on women and children And so that was the other really easy to get agreement on peace. So Millennium Development Goals, peace, justice, equity, education, water, there's climate stuff in the Sustainable Development Goals now, education for girls in particular, vaccinations, medicine, healthcare, all those things, and then climate issues, and then the small arms. And so the faith leaders of the G8 and G20 countries have all agreed to this. And every year, there's been an Interfaith Leaders Summit to parallel the G8, or now it's the G20 because the G20 has more, those kinds of issues are more in the purview of the G20, and those same points are reinforced every time. And so that there's huge unity of groups that one might think were diverse, but that all have the same pull towards peace and justice and the end of poverty and the end of hunger and making sure that everyone has the health care they need and clean water and all of those things, education. This is agreed upon by all. Getting the governments to move on it in all the countries, harder point. But there are signs of hope, and the Canadian Council of Churches is not political. There's no, we cannot be. That doesn't mean that we don't have our opinions, but there is no overt political reality, because we have to work with or challenge or support or not whoever is in power according to what we think they're doing. But I will tell you one story, and this is not, and right now in this particular context, might not be seen as such a mark in the favor of the Liberal government around, because now we're in the midst of all this the peacekeeping change, controversy, not living up to it, trying to do something different, depends who you are talking to, how you define it. But we went in to see, we were in Parliament Hill, always, and going to see the different political parties, and this was before the Liberal government was in power, and went in to see Carolyn Bennett, who's always really good at pushing back on everybody about First Nations issues. You say, these are all the things that need to be done around First Nations and justice, and she'll go, yeah, and what are you doing? And here's the list of things you should be doing. And going, that's good. Good response, Carolyn. That's totally right and totally fair. Anyway, went in to see her, talk about all of that. And at the end of the conversation said, and this was when the Arms Trade Treaty had not been signed. We signed now, we just ratified?
Signed but not ratified.
Signed but not ratified, right. So it was right before the previous government was not going to sign it.
Right.
And so we were in Carolyn's office and raised the issue of the Arms Trade Treaty, which believes that it is better that small arms are not traded illegally across borders. This is a good thing, and everyone is united that this should not be happening. So we said, okay, so the signing date is Friday. This was Wednesday morning. The signing date is Friday, and word seems to be that the Harper government isn't going to sign, and this is shocking. And Carolyn says, okay, tell me more about this. Let's talk more about this. Okay. So then we're in Justin Trudeau's office Friday morning, and said, now, leader of the opposition, as he was at the time, or no, third party, I think he was third party leader at the time, said, so, about the Arms Trade Treaty. He says, tell me more about the Arms Trade Treaty. Talk about the Arms Trade Treaty. And no, I've got the story backwards. I knew this was going to happen. We saw Trudeau first and said, the Arms Trade Treaty, it looks like it's not going to be signed. And he said, tell me more about the Arms Trade Treaty. So, I full marks for that. He said, I don't know much about it. Talk to me about it. So we tell him the whole thing about the Arms Trade Treaty. Then we're in Carolyn Bennett's office on the Friday morning, and mention it and say, when we met with Justin Trudeau, we talked about the Arms Trade Treaty, and she said, oh yes, we've got questions all ready to raise in the House this afternoon. And that was from Wednesday morning to 9 o'clock Friday morning. They had taken the issue so seriously. Now they were a party in opposition, so obviously they want to use what they can to, get at the government of the day. But they went from Wednesday morning to, so it was less than 48 hours, and they had taken it so seriously that they had questions that they were really going to push on in the House. So I just, but the point in telling that story is to say, asking those kinds of questions and pushing really hard on a focused issue can actually sometimes, no guarantee, work. But that was also because I was able to say, here we are, representing the Canadian Council of Churches, my little elevator speech. More than 85% of the Christians in the country, the most inclusive church council in the world, blah, 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 my little elevator speech. But that's hard to ignore. When you're saying that you are in, Justin Trudeau, Carol Bennett's office representing millions and millions of Christians with connections with all the faith communities who are very diverse. They said, yeah, the Greek Orthodox are totally on board. They would like you to get on board with the Arms Trade Treaty. Yes, the Salvation Army. Yes, the Roman Catholics. Yes, the United Church. Yes, the Anglicans. Yes, the Coptic Orthodox. When you list all that, it's really hard to be ignored when you're focused. When you're focused on that. So there's one story, or actually two kind of combined, related to each other, and continually the churches have continued to push around the Arms Trade Treaty and implementation of other things that we know don't get implemented. And if you want to read more about peacekeeping and the new, you can read everything Walter writes. He's in the paper a lot. By the way, Walter Duran, the president of the World Federalist Movement in Canada, and I, for whatever reason, have been the chair of the executive for a long time. Probably as long as I've been at the Canadian Council of Churches. Actually, if I think about it, it's probably close to 15 years, and I chaired the council before that. And interestingly, for those who, again, are interested in the trivia, there's a lot of faith connection in the World Federalist Movement, which we bring Fergus up to speed on. It's sort of sometimes against his better judgment. But the president of the World Federalist Movement for Canada and internationally was the very Reverend Dr. Lois Wilson, former senator, and she was the president. The Reverend Dr. James Christie has been very involved. I'm very involved. Walter brings his faith perspective to it. The interrelationship between peace and religion. I mean, I don't think I really have to be convincing about that. I mean, I think people doesn't see that really easily. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees on how you do it. But that's the conversation we've all got to be having together, is how we're going to do that. But because we're Science for Peace, I brought a particular science, unity, and diversity story, and it begins with a poem, which is what I've been holding open here on the, all right, I've been holding open here with my complete Robbie Barons, which was published in, I'm just looking for the, you can't, it's easier to find the publication dates now. When was this? Anyway, this goes back to, I'll show you the book, but, which is in pieces. But this goes back to the 1800s, which is a book which I inherited. And Robbie Barons is known for many poems, and Auld Lang Syne is one that people often know, the Selkirk Grace people often know. This is one of his sort of, in terms of what people know, is kind of level 2 poems, and it's called To a Mouse. So yeah, some of you clearly know it. I'm only going to read the first two verses. But Robbie Barons says, "Wee sleeked carrot and timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou needna start away so hasty with bickering brattle. I would be laith to rin and chase thee with murdering cattle. I'm truly sorry. Man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal." So Robbie Barons is...
You read that in Canadian English?
Well, I did that in Canadian English.
I had to really...
Yeah, I will. And just in case anybody foolishly is impressed with my accent, I am Scottish, but this Braid Scots, it's what it's written in, and I did that in Scotland, and somebody came to me and said, "That is the worst Scottish accent I've ever heard." Sorry. Okay. We sleek it. I actually don't know what that is, but you little cowering, timorous beast, what a panic is in your breast. you don't need to start away with such haste and kind of like bickering brattle, like just squeak, squeak, squeak. I would be loath to chase thee in a murderous way. I'm not chasing you in a murderous way. What's happened is he's plowing, and it's turned up a mouse's nest, right? And of course the mouse has gone away, and he's kind of apologizing to the mouse and saying it was an accident and I don't mean you any harm. And the second verse, which is a little easier to understand, he says, I'm truly sorry that man's, we would read that as persons now, but really sorry that man's dominion, taking control in this long period of time that we've thought we had dominion over the earth, which actually is a mistranslation of the biblical text, by the way, in case anyone wants to blame religion for that. And there are lots of things to blame religion for, but it is a mistranslation of the text. But he says, I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union. So that there is an underlying union of all of creation, and our human need to dominate has broken that. And it justifies that ill opinion which is making you startled, because you're afraid. He's saying the mouse is afraid, justifiably, that Robbie Burns, I'm going to kill you. But there's reason, because yes, as human beings, we have taken control and done what we want. And then he says, makes you startle at me, thy earthborn companion and fellow mortal. So it's a lovely unity of creation and all things interconnected, which Robbie Burns was really, really good at. I read the poem at the beginning of a sermon I was preaching in a Presbyterian church, right? Presbyterian church associated with Scotland, right? Church of Scotland. And was using it for the same reason I'm going to use it now. And at the end of the service, I did my very best, Braid Scots, and read the poem, and it was all, interesting, I thought. But at the end of it, the minister comes up and says, oh, that was great. He says, great sermon. And he says, great reading of the poem, and really great you did in a Scottish accent. Of course, there are actually no Scots in the congregation here. Right. That was my assumption, Presbyterian, Scottish. But that poem became kind of a signature piece for a piece of work that the Canadian Council of Churches did. And it was called the Onco Mouse. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. So it's Onco, like the preface on oncology, like the cancer preface, O-N-C-O, the Onco Mouse. Mouse, like an actual mouse. And what happened, this was my introduction to the Canadian Council of Churches, and I had to go to the Senate. I had to fly to the Senate in Ottawa and give press interviews in French on patenting. My French is good, but that was a reach. But what happened was, there was a process, and medical research and scientific research, of course, is always going on and has brought huge, like incalculable benefit to humankind. Is anybody watching the Outlander series, or any of you as addicted to that as I am? Nobody else? Okay, well right now, Claire, because that's what Jamie's Scottish and he calls her Claire, has been kidnapped because she's a surgeon from the 1900s, or 1960s actually, but she goes back in time to the 1700s. She's been kidnapped and she's on a ship where typhus has broken out. And so she is on the ship and trying to save as many sailors as she can, and she can't explain to them, but Jamie, her husband, knows that she's from the future. And he's saying, but I can't let you go because you'll get it and die. And she'll go, no, I won't, because I've been vaccinated. In the 1900s, you see, we've developed a vaccination for this, and the plot's way more complex than that. But it was great. It's a great reminder in a dramatic television series about the tremendous benefits of science. Science, absolutely huge. And in research, of course, enormous. And goodness knows we all want to cure cancer as fast as possible, and we have all lost people we loved to cancer. We want to cure it as fast as possible. But about 2 decades ago, DuPont, yes, DuPont, the company, the commercial company, was funding a whole lot of research into cancer research to combat cancer, and figured out a way to patent a certain gene sequence in a mouse. And so what they could do was they could cause the mouse to get cancer. Yeah, I know. You can see how this is, and you know, the argument on paper was, well, of course, if we can cause the mouse to get cancer, then we can do much more research, and we can understand cancer, and we can find a way to combat it in humans. That's the argument. Not wrong. Not wrong. But what they were also doing was making a huge profit off it. Right? It's DuPont. It's not, you know, the University of Toronto pristine, pure science lab. Not that there is such a thing as a pristine, pure science lab. But as I said, science has as many assumptions and biases as anything else. But anyway, they found a way to do this. And so then they went for a patent. Well, what they were wanting to patent was not the process that caused the mouse to get cancer, but they wanted to patent the mouse, the actual living mouse. And at that point, the faith communities of Canada, and particularly the Canadian Council of Churches, said, no, you can't own life. It goes back to the Robbie Burns poem, right? Like suddenly then the person digging up the mouse's burrow by accident, like would actually have a legal right to own that mouse and destroy it in any way that they wanted. And I mean, we know that that happens, but they would have actually the legal protection to do it. And we said, no, you can't do that. And so we actually, again with no money, because that's, you know, the reality, took it to the Supreme Court and went to the Supreme Court to say human beings, whatever the value of the scientific process, and you can, you know, argue it one way or the, you know, is this, I mean, most cosmetic companies now are saying that, you know, they're not using animals in testing. You know, this has become the way to go. So that's another issue to argue, but you can't actually own, as a company, you can't own a living being, even if it's for scientific research that, you know, might be of benefit and will make you a lot of money along the way. But it's called the Oncomos, and to our shock, we won. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, well, they didn't say, we would have liked them to have said, no, human beings cannot own life, even for the process of, you know, scientific research. You can't own life. We would have liked them to say that, but they didn't actually say that, although they sort of did. But they, of course, the judges have to go according to the law, Canadian law. And they said, actually, the Canadian patent system doesn't allow for this. The Canadian patent law does not allow for human beings to own life. But during, and we had a lawyer arguing this, during the court proceedings, some of the judges said to DuPont, or DuPont's lawyers, let's get really clear about this. If we were to grant this, does that mean that it's the beginning of a slippery slope and that a company, a scientific process, could actually then own human beings eventually? And the lawyer had to say that would be, if you rule that we can do this, that is a repercussion that could happen. And so the Supreme, so we won. What we said, the way we put it was, and the way we did the press release was the mouse won. But I raised that again as an issue of the unity in diversity. And one of the huge criticisms, I did a ton of interviews at the time, was, oh, the faith communities, you're just against science. You know, you're just anti-science. We're saying, no, that is not true one bit. Back to the Galileo story that I told you at the beginning, which was definitely not the church's shining hour, that's for sure. But it wasn't Galileo's either. And I mean, who would not think that laser eye surgery and all the cancer research that's being done and vaccinations, well, unfortunately I confess to you, my sister is an anti-vaxxer, it's made our relationship quite strained actually. You know, the AIDS HIV research which has been done, which has enabled, you know, millions to live that would not have. And we go back again though to the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. How is it that we are going to ensure a just equitable life with clean water for everyone? Science is the only way that we're going to do that. How is it that we're going to get vaccinations and medicines and all the health care that people need? Well, that's also through science and political will. There's the whole political will and financing part of it too. But these are all scientific-based processes that all the faith communities of the world think are crucial to peace and justice and the good care of creation and all people. I'm going to check the time. I have another story, but I might save it.
Yeah, go on.
Okay, one more story. Oh yeah, by the way, Darwin, let's talk about Darwin just for a minute. Darwin was the first generation of spectacular scientists who wasn't clergy.
Oh.
He was the first generation. He was going to be. He was studying to be ordained, and then what happened? He did his undergrad. I got this from my son, who's done a lot of work in religion and science, as has my eldest daughter actually. And so he was in the track to be ordained, and then I think he heard that the Beagle was leaving, and so it's like he had to be on the ship, and then he just got all distracted. But the understanding at the time was, to be a good scientist, you had to, well, everybody was religious. To what degree is another question, but everybody just was. But there was no, the point I want to make is, there was no thinking that there was a contradiction between science and faith, that the two completely informed each other, and Darwin was on that track, and then the ship was leaving and he leapt on board, and the rest is as we know it. But the relationship has always been intimate and close, and it's when we talk to each other. So yeah, one more story. And this one came after my time at the Canadian Council of Churches. It has just happened, and you can still find it on Twitter. The Canadian Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches joined together, interestingly, another place where Canada is considered to be in the lead, not a middle power, but a leading power, is around technical, concrete expressions of the relationship between religion and science. We're ahead of the game on this. We have a biotechnology, what we used to call a biotechnology reference group, which we now call Faith and Life Sciences group, that nobody else has in the world. Like, how did this happen? I still find it quite amazing. And the Americans come up and they go, how do you have this? We can't figure out how to create this in a way that we get everybody on board. We haven't got everybody on board. What's your problem? But anyway, that's Canadian arrogance. Anyway, the Canadian Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches have just put on a convention called Redesigning the Tree of Life, Synthetic Biology, and the Future of Food. This is what the faith communities are deeply engaged in, is what is the impact of genetically modified foods, synthetic biology, on food, on nutrition, on famine, on starvation. Like, how are all these things in relationship? And we have a resource book actually for congregations which raises those kind of questions. So, should a person of faith grow genetically modified foods? We don't answer the question, but we ask the question because it's really important for people to talk about that. What do you do in the face of genetically modified foods? But how can this not be a major conversation? So what we're trying to do is take that, they, because I'm no longer the General Secretary, but it's a conversation we need to be having, and we need to be all having together. And that's not to say we're going to agree, but it's a direct peace question, because what do we know is one of the leading causes of violence and conflict is famine. I mean, this is hugely important. And so if we could fix, suppose, it's going to sound like a Disney movie now, but suppose we could buy genetically modified foods and the scientific process solve all the famines in the world, what would the repercussions be? What would happen, Walter, in terms of peacekeeping? Like, it's easy to say that would solve all the problems, and we wouldn't need peacekeeping because everybody would be really peaceful, would it? It's going to be more complex than that, but we need to be having those kind of questions. which is why I said, you know, early on, and have referred several times to the Sustainable Development Goals, because that's the linking, and it's linking all those things together. So genetically modified foods, synthetic biology are related to peacekeeping because famine is a root cause of violence in the world. And I will tell you one more final story, and then I really will stop. So when the International Criminal Court, Walter and I both being, and some of the rest of you, died in the World Federalist. When the International Criminal Court, so this is an older story, was about to, and I want to raise a hard issue by this, was moving towards actually becoming a reality, and we know there are complexities, and we know there's tons of work that needs to be done, and we know that some things are not working as they should. Yes. All those things are known, but when it was moving towards actually being born, and the World Federalists were the leading NGO in Canada, and actually Fergus, who's the executive director of the World Federalist Movement, was actually the NGO coordinator globally for the International Criminal Court. When it was moving towards that, I was asked to give a presentation specifically on that to the Voice of Women, who some of you will know well. So I gave my whole, and at the time I knew the technical aspects better than I do now, but I did the whole, you know, technical layer of the International Criminal Court, and everybody's nodding, and everybody's nodding, and everybody's nodding, and this is good, this is good, this is good. Until I got near the end, and somebody put up their hand and said, now wait just a minute here. If you're going to indict or charge leaders, global leaders who have caused genocide to their own people, wait, and you're going to take them to The Hague and try them, wait, aren't you going to have to use military force to get them there? And I said, well, what are you thinking they're going to do exactly? Receive a letter in the mail saying you are about to be charged before the International Criminal Court for, in the case of Assad in Syria, the murder of 400,000 of your people. Just please get on a plane. You know, your hotel reservation will be waiting when you arrive. I said, do you think that's going to work? But it's not really a funny or a trivial story, because for that person who was a pacifist, who believed firmly and completely and totally in non-coercive force, or non-coercive anything, it raised a huge issue for her. And so the issues are complicated. And of course, we couldn't resolve it in that one evening, but that's why we've all got to be talking, not in our silos. We've all got to be talking about the issues of peace in all their complexity, and not getting also so overwhelmed by the complexity. The other big danger, so the big danger, one is we don't talk to each other, but the other big danger is that the issues seem so complicated and so hard that then we don't move anywhere, and we get weighted down by them. And so that's why the peacekeeping discussion, which is so lively right now, is crucial, because it's dealing in concretes. And that's why the Sustainable Development Goals are really, really crucial, because they're dealing in concretes and they're measurable. And Canada also has, third fantastic thing about Canada, there are so many, is the best G8, G20 research institute in the world is in Canada. It's at the Munk Center, which is like right, you could practically spit from here to there across the campus. It's in Trinity College. Yep, that way, that way, good, thank you. That way. It's in Trinity College. Right on Harvard, and that's the best G8, G20 research institute in the world, and it's in Canada, and they track the Sustainable Development Goals and what progress each country is making. So we have some concrete measurables by which we can be inspired and see the progress and move forward, knowing that, you know, the progress we want to see is not always as fast. In 2 weeks, can we fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals? Maybe not, but by 2030, maybe.
You're talking about John Curtin?
Yes, John Curtin, exactly. Exactly. So on John Curtin's, in the name of John Curtin, I'll stop.